Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome to the Rotary Club of Seattle, one of the oldest clubs in the, wait, I got this mixed up. I always get this mixed up. We are one of the largest clubs in the world and the fourth oldest, established in 1909. For those visiting, my name is Mark Wright. I'm the club's president this year. It's so great to have you all here today. We've got a great program lined up today. Our long program speaker today is member Steve Davis, the CEO of PATH. Let's give a round of applause for Steve for being here today. So I know a lot of you are familiar with PATH and the work that it does. It's an amazing NGO. If you're not familiar with PATH, get ready today to really be inspired. Steve, it's so great to have you here. Also, I want to welcome members of the Gates Foundation Alumni Group, the Washington Global Health Alliance, and Steve's colleagues from PATH. It's also an honor to have Carol Pandak from Polio Plus as our short program speaker today. Carol is in town for World Polio Day, which was yesterday at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, so we'll have more about Carol in just a few minutes. All right, we begin our programs with some inspiration and song. Our invocator today is Sten Chrissy. Come on up, Sten.
Thank you. Just some inspirational thoughts to share with you. In August, for this program segment, I shared observations made by Usha Sabu, wife of RI past President Rajendra Sabu. And Usha said, immunizing our own kids is ordinary. Immunizing all the children of the world is Rotary. Giving education to our own kids is ordinary. Building thousands of schools for poor children is Rotary. And so on she went, describing the extraordinary work of Rotary to make the world a better place beyond ordinary. Usha's remarks came to mind last week when Kathy Williams reviewed our club's Service Foundation report for the past year. That report describes 29 service projects your Seattle for Rotary Club supported over the course of the year. A partial list follows. Job training and counseling for homeless youth. Opportunities for youth to experience the arts. Providing health benefits for low-income and homeless people. Feeding the hungry. Dictionaries for low-income third graders. Early marriage prevention in Afghanistan. Malaria prevention in Zambia. An Ethiopian water project. Removing landmines in Vietnam, a shelter kitchen for teens escaping sex trafficking. The pains of humanity addressed by our club's Service Foundation covers each one of Rotary's 6 areas of focus, and each project deserves a place on Usha Sabu's checklist. Congratulations to the Service Foundation Board for your good stewardship of our foundation's resources. And special thanks to those who volunteered to serve on one of our service committees. The world is a better place because of you. If you have not read the Foundation's printed report, do so. You will be inspired. Last Sunday on the George Stephanopoulos news show, General David Petraeus asserted that America's greatest problem is not North Korea, not Russia, not Afghanistan. Our biggest challenge is the lack of civility and political discourse in our country today. Given our times, I could not be more proud to be a Rotarian. I hope you are too.
Right, to introduce our main speaker today is our Membership Vice President, Corinne Cavanaugh. Please welcome Corinne.
Well, it is my honor the day following World Polio Day to introduce our main program speaker. Steve Davis is president and CEO at PATH. He combines extensive experience in technology as a business leader, global health advocacy, and as a social innovator to accelerate great ideas and bring life-saving solutions to scale. Prior to joining PATH in 2012, he served as the Director of Social Innovation at McKinstry & Company. He was CEO of global health media firm Corbis. He was also interim director of the Infectious Disease Research Institute, and he practiced law at the international firm K&L Gates. He also worked extensively on refugee programs and policies, and Chinese politics and law. Currently, in addition to being president and CEO at PATH, Mr. Davis is a lecturer on social innovation at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. He's also on far too many boards to list here today, but trust me, they're prestigious. I will share he earned his BA from Princeton, his MA in Chinese Studies from University of Washington. Normally there's a woohoo there. And his law degree from Columbia. What I found most inspiring and impressive about Steve Davis is that he's a leading voice for Seattle area's global health community as he travels around the world. As a member of our club, we're grateful he's able to share with us today what global health innovation looks like. And we as Rotarians are thrilled to continue to be a powerful ally in PATH's work to bring health within reach of underserved communities. Steve?
So thank you very much. It's really a great honor to be here in my hometown and with so many extraordinary people that are committed to so many of these amazing projects. And I actually spend too much of my time around the world. I actually am not home very often. And almost everywhere I go, whether it's in a rural village in Zambia or it's in Addis or it's in London or Davos, there is a Rotarian there. And we are constantly talking about how do we move forward the broader agenda of making this a better world. And I'm so proud to be able to share today. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about a hometown hero that I hope most of you know about, but I actually think we've probably not done the best job celebrating as we talk about coffee and software and airplanes, other things like that coming out of the Seattle region and really affecting the way the world works. There is a whole lot of happening around global health, and PATH has been one of the leaders in that for many years. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what we do. It's a classic entrepreneurial story. 40 years ago this year, 3 sort of breakthrough innovators, people that were a little tired of the status quo, 3 people, well, not all from Seattle, but here in Seattle, decided that we needed to do things differently, that there was a lot of work going on development, but the problem is people weren't thinking about what's the quality of the products we're being used to help support other countries. What are the ways we can bring business into this problem? So they came up with a model to say, how do we actually shape product development? How do we actually start thinking about business engagement in the world of global health and development? How do we make the whole world a better place by thinking about those problems? And that actually was a breakthrough in terms of how we actually have shaped this whole global agenda to raise everybody's ability to participate in a quality life. And so 40 years later, PATH has changed a lot, from 3 entrepreneurs to a global brand, then work around the world. So let me actually share just a little bit of what that looks like. Thank you. And I wish I had time today to tell you some of the great stories behind these pictures. Stories about kids that have, the work we're doing in maternal child health, and kids who now are seeing an opportunity to not only survive, but thrive. The initiatives we're doing in early childhood development to actually push the boundaries of health and health innovation around the world. The 24 plus vaccines that we're working on, next generation vaccines to reach the poorest people in the world, and actually building a pipeline of vaccines right here out of Seattle that parallels what the biggest industry players are doing in terms of breadth and depth with our Center for Vaccine Access. A lot of work we're doing in battling the issues around nutrition and malnutrition in the world, both in terms of thinking about NCDs and overweight and obesity in poor parts of the world, but also how do we continue to fortify rice and do other ways to reach, in fact, about 500,000 kids in India are getting fortified rice coming out of an innovation that started right here in the Pacific Northwest in their everyday school feeding programs. The range of activities and stories I could tell is pretty broad, and it's always a challenge to want to tell you more about what our employees in 70 countries around the world are doing, and some of the partnerships we have, and some of the products, and the really cool, innovative products we're working on. But today I thought I would actually talk less about the whats, and I'm happy to, in the Q&A, to talk more about some of the specifics, but talk a little bit about the how. So when I go around the world, or when our partners think of PATH, or I met last week with the new Director General at WHO, and people like that, they say, what do they think of PATH? Well, they think of a leader in global health innovation, and they think about the three things that we really do quite a lot of. One is innovation. One is scaling up. So you saw the numbers that we're reaching several 100 million people a year directly with our ideas. So this is about not just cool ideas coming out of a garage, but also how do we get them into the hands of millions of people that need them the most. But the biggest ingredient, the magic sauce in the work that we do, is partnerships. It's how do we actually not do this ourselves? How do we find people who we can do that work with? And how do we actually build these partnerships across sectors, so public sector, private sector, social sector, but also across boundaries, like geographical boundaries, across industries, so having telecom, work with pharma, work with logistics, and it's that level of partnership that I think is what PATH is probably best known for. So I thought I would talk a little bit about something happening in Zambia, partly because it's a really important activity. Partly, of course, it's something that this club and many Rotarians are involved in. So Zambia is a country that has really in the first in sub-Saharan Africa to have said, based on the evidence and the work we've been doing together with the Zambian government, to say, you know, this malaria thing, we can get rid of it here. And malaria is an extraordinarily difficult disease. I mean, and it continues, over 500,000 people a year continue to die of this. And yet it is a disease that we are beginning to get our handle on. It's a disease that is eventually making it to the same list that polio is on. Our belief as an industry and as a community that we can eliminate it regionally and probably eventually eradicate it with the right set of tools. So we're quite excited to be part of this larger global malaria control and elimination strategy, and particularly some of the work in Zambia. And what's important about this work is we're bringing a multiple points of view to it. And I won't go through the science and the public health issues other than to say it's not about just bringing a new tool, although PATH is proud to have been a key partner in developing the first ever vaccine in this area. And diagnostics and treatments, but also it's so much about how do you build these partnerships to enable this to move forward. So what's quite interesting is in southern province, so you look at the map of Zambia, and instead of just saying, okay, how do we do the same thing again and again, how do we start breaking the thinking, the chain of approach to start tackling this with some better operational research and better data. And that's actually the biggest key here, is that we're beginning to start using new partnerships and partnerships, some of which are based right here in Seattle, to rethink the way you go about eliminating malaria. So these are some examples coming out of this complicated partnership. So identifying the facilities and now geocoding each of those facilities in Zambia using new technologies. And then identifying in a certain province, how do we really start understanding a different approach to going after the malaria parasite? So just for those who may not understand malaria, different than polio. Malaria is a parasite. It's carried by mosquitoes. And the tricky part with malaria, a certain type of mosquito only bites at a certain time. There are different types of malaria. I won't go through all of that, except that what's the most important thing is only about 20% of people that carry the parasite actually have the symptoms of malaria. So the problem we have is 80% of the people in these communities might be walking around with the parasite in their blood, and they're not symptomatic, they're not sick, but they're engaging this reservoir to go on and on and on because, of course, the mosquito bites them, they bite their neighbor, and the problem gets worse. So thinking about that problem, to say, let's get into the details here. Let's start adding more capacity with many new community health workers aligned with the government. Let's start mapping these regions down to the village level with the data we have. And of course, some of this is work we learned from the polio eradication work. Let's go all the way to the household level. And so this is actually a screenshot from an Android phone where you go into the village and they actually say, look, this is a place where we have an outbreak of malaria. This household, whoops, let's go back. That didn't screenshot. Well, the way it works, it's supposed to have multiple clicks, but that if we identify a household that has a malaria case based on meteorological data and based on epidemiological data, you can kind of know the range in which the parasitic mosquito will be around that house. And then you map that region and make sure every home and person in that region is tested and treated. And therefore, you're actually kind of really cornering exactly where these parasitic mosquitoes are. And that's actually only been enabled because of these new tools, which are very simple to use and are actually, we've been able to distribute them and have caseworkers use that and to tackle this sort of how do we know exactly, not everybody, where do we really go after where these parasitic mosquitoes are. And then what's really great is the ability to start actually sharing and explaining how this is affecting treatment. This is just one chart to show that the number of malaria cases just 4 years ago has dropped dramatically by using this very targeted, digitally enabled approach to focusing on how do we actually start eliminating malaria and getting those numbers lower and lower. This is a comparable chart showing the difference between two provinces. The bottom province is where we haven't taken this approach to mapping and tracing, and the top is, you can see the dramatic difference seasonally on malaria. So, but where do we go next? Well, you start saying not only is it how do we track and trace at a household level, but let's bring some of these partners here in Seattle, the Tableaus and the Visios and the Twilios and the Boxes and other technology companies to help us solve this problem. So we've engaged them in a partnership to bring some of their smartest people to sit with us and say, how do we go further? How do we go in the future? And start mapping based on the geological evidence. This is not working. That you can start, this should have, it's just not working. There's where it starts showing where are the swampy areas, where are the pooled water, and then how is that going to affect the epidemiology of these mosquitoes? And then you start layering that on top of, here's the data we have and the visual data we have for the homes in this region. And then you map that together and layer it on top. And we are actually beginning to have very specific ideas about how to go after, based on a variety of data, how to put this together and visualize it so the community health worker has a very easy approach to going after these problems. Now, this may seem super high tech, like, wow, cool charts, and actually if they were animated, they're even cooler. But what's so amazing about it is we're beginning to simplify this down to a simple Android phone. We're getting it into the hands of health workers. We're visualizing this data for ministers of health, for people at the World Bank, for people at foundations and other supporters to say, these are the ways that you can make this, what has been an impossible task, possible. So it's all done through partnerships, and these are just a few of the many partnerships at PATH. We have literally thousands of partnerships, and it is in the kind of the art and science of bringing different people together. Often we're invisible in these projects. We don't brand ourselves as the people doing this. We're actually trying to guide this through partners. But that's where the world is going. More and more of these cross-sectoral partnerships, and no partnership is more important in many ways than the Rotary partnership. That the work we have done with Rotary, of course, as a global health community in polio is phenomenal. But I'm very excited about the current work, and then the new conversations we're having about what we can do with the Rotary partnership further in Zambia, and then as Zambia becomes a model for the rest of sub-Saharan Africa, and we're even having conversations in India and other parts of the world where we can go with that. So it's an exciting time to be in global health. I always like to start or end a speech to say, you know, despite the headlines, which, and sometimes headlines are in the form of tweets, that actually the trend lines in this work are pretty good. We are seeing enormous improvement in the world broadly in terms of pulling people out of poverty. We are seeing enormous improvements in reducing maternal and child health across the board, morbidity and mortality. And we're seeing family planning reach people around the world. We're seeing a number of improvements. So I want to give you hope and hopefully a little bit of inspiration for the work that you've all supported, that this community supports, that this city and region of the world is supporting for the whole world, and say that I really do believe the best is yet to come. Thank you. I'm happy to take a few questions. Is that right?
Steve, thank you. Can you talk about the connection between these diseases and economic conditions in these countries, and the connection between the solution and how that affects the economy?
Yeah, no, this is the integrated development. Well, let me step back. The economics of global health and development these are two of the same sides of the coin. I mean, the same sides of the same coin, and that we know from a huge amount of evidence that diseases are actually often a condition of poverty, right? So, and that's kind of a given, that we know that people that we've allowed, or the world, some of these places where markets have failed, that we are not able to reach people, and therefore people who are poor in low resource settings or in vulnerable communities end up being more at risk to a lot of diseases. What we're also understanding better, and there's some interesting data on this, is that actually diseases are the cause of poverty too. So many people don't live in chronic poverty, and I'm talking about, you know, under $1 a day. They actually often, you know, are moving out of that, and then an event pulls their family back in. And the number one thing, there can be droughts and floods and funerals and other things, but the number one reason is a health event in their family that pulls them back into poverty. So there's this sort of interesting cycle between health and poverty that's a two-way cycle. But at the macro level, as you level that up, you know, there have been studies showing the trillions of dollars of economic harm that comes out of malaria in the continent of Africa because of productivity, because of illness, because of the drain on the resources. There's been a very interesting set of studies to show the relationship between good health and poverty in family size. That is, people get healthier, they're more optimistic about their condition, they have better support for their children, they tend to have fewer children, and you can see that in the way the world's evolved. So there's a huge, very much a virtuous cycle that we should be thinking about here, about global health and development, education, health, economic development, and then the third element that I'm flying out to DC again tonight to talk about is health security and how the our national and global security interests are tied to this virtuous cycle, because without having those other elements, the risk of epidemic and pandemics, the risk of health security issues are even higher. So we need to keep sort of tying all three of those things together. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. I was hoping you could share with us what are the impacts of contraceptive technologies in low resource settings, and what have you seen from some of your innovations?
Sure. So PATH has spent a lot of its work on the area of how do we provide higher quality tools to people that want to use contraceptive methods, and also how do we help support the introduction and promotion of those in appropriate settings. One of the, and this is an important piece of a global commitment to ensure that there's an enormous unmet need of at least predict a model that would say a couple 100 million women, if not more, are actually desiring modern family planning technologies and not having access to them. So how do we go after that unmet need? We've done a lot of different work, and it's hard to describe all the breadth and depth of it, but probably one of the coolest things is an innovation that came out of our lab and working with partners and with the foundation and others, is we had developed, for the purpose of making vaccines easier, delivery of vaccines easier, which we work a lot on, is a little plastic bubble. And it's called Uniject, and it makes makes it easier, so you don't have to have a qualified doctor or nurse fill in the syringe and getting the bubble out and all that. So you could just put a pre-filled plastic bubble, and then some like Joe Schmo like me could actually inject somebody. I mean, you don't have to be that qualified to just with a little needle on the end. Well, we did that for the purposes of a vaccine tool, easier, adoptable. But we then took that idea, working with others, and combined it with what Pfizer has a injectable contraceptive that's long-lasting for 3 months, and have combined those two things together. And this is oversimplified, but right now we are in the process of continuing to not only do the operational research and testing that, but rolling that out. Over 1 million units are going through Africa today. The last DG of the World Health Organization said this was probably the biggest game changer in family planning. And the reason that's true, which is important, is that so often people who want these tools, because of the community conditions, because of the religious or family taboos, because of the patriarchal hierarchy they're living in, they are not allowed to go and use family planning tools. So this gives women the ability to self-inject. And that empowerment to take it out of, I don't have to go to a clinic and someone doesn't have to go do something to me or for me, I can do it myself with this tool, will change the way we work. So we're quite excited about thinking about new innovations like that. Yes, sir.
Hi, Steve.
Hey, Carl.
Hi, Steve. Thank you for what you're doing. I noticed the data show a marked seasonality in the incidence of malaria. How does that affect, I imagine that's wet conditions and swampy conditions. How does that affect the work that you're doing? And is it you target things during those periods of seasonality?
Yeah, and so seasonality in disease control and elimination eradication is a central feature, actually, particularly in a situation where you've got the disease is carried by a parasite, a vector, like a mosquito. And so we are always sort of managing, and so we actually set up these programs to think about the wet season and the dry season, and when do you do the specific campaigns, and how do you go after that? Because, of course, if you can control it in the most robust time of the year, you're going to be able to carry that through the year. But it's a central piece of any kind of management of disease that is related to a mosquito or a sand flea or some other kind of vector.
Hi, Steve. Is this on? Oh, great. Great talk. I notice you just have a plethora of partners. You have for-profit, not-for-profit. Would you give us some insight into how PATH aligns the interests of these very diverse partners for the global good and some lessons that you've learned in that very important work that you do.
Yeah, this is great question, and this is I think a particularly exciting issue. It's also, I think, an exciting time for this issue. This is actually, it was mentioned that I appointment and I teach at Stanford, and this is actually what I focus on, which is how do we bring public sector, private sector, and social sector, and by social sector, philanthropic organizations, nonprofits, academic organizations together to solve some of the biggest world's problems. So we've been sort of looking at what are the sort of best practices and what's worked in terms of aligning the incentive, say, of like a Pfizer with our innovation. How do we de-risk a lot of this, because these are not natural markets. These are failed markets. These are poor markets. So there's not as much, my kind of view is if there was enough economic incentive for industry to be there alone, it would be. So what we have to do is often pave the way, de-risk, come up with alternative mechanisms for pulling enough market together to aggregate demand. We have to kind of create mechanisms so in areas where you don't have enough resources to get industry's long-term engagement. Our view is it's not about, we beg all day long. I spend a lot of time begging people. We borrow, we come up with financing innovations, we do all that. But our actually premise is it's not long-term effective to just be always looking for long-term subsidies or long-term in these products. I mean, not talking about the organizations, but so we would like industry to take it on and build it. So most of our 100 so products in our pipeline, we will not distribute them as Path. We will not brand them. They are someone else's products. We're helping shape, design, take the risk out of the development, doing some of the innovation. But our hope is those industries will then, companies will continue to distribute it, will make enough money so that they will have an incentive to continue to distribute, to invest in it. So it's very much about giving them the incentive to keep in the game.
I think you may have already started the answer to the question, which is to what extent do these innovations have industrialized nation application, and are those profits utilized to help fund development?
Yeah, that's a big, hairy, complicated, economic question actually at the end. But the broad answer is. Many of our products and tools in the global health space, actually, we know there's a version for the developed world or the rich world and so one of our jobs is to say, okay, we've figured that out for my kid. How do we do it for somebody else's kid? And therefore, we're often in the business of trying to figure out how to adapt. Take something and say, could we make it more effective, cheaper, more accessible? And so with that, there's often, I'm on a board where one of the big device companies, global publicly traded device companies, and how do they take some of their portfolio products and help shape them in a new way to go after these low resource markets. But the flip side is also true. We know that there's sometimes things you have to develop specifically for all sorts of reasons, whether it's cultural or access or geographic or cultural. So then we are actually creating a lot of products that are specifically targeted for a low resource setting, but we've seen a number of them, quote, boomerang, which is even though we're going out there with the product, they're actually making their way back to the domestic markets through the companies. So actually, one of the things we're exploring is whether we should have a domestic program ourselves to look at some of the innovations in probably what could be argued to be one of the most challenged, inequitable health systems in the world, which is here in the United States.
Here's your last question of the day.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Steve, for being with us today. I wanted just to ask you to bring us up to date on the meningitis story and to take us back to how that got started as something that was developed for the belt and not for anybody else.
Yeah, sure. So it's a wonderful story, which I'll try to really abbreviate, but is there was a horrible disease, meningitis A, and people who have kids know the fear of meningitis. Well, in this part of sub-Saharan Africa, literally it would sweep through what's called the meningitis belt from Senegal to Somalia, and not only kill lots of kids, but it would, on an annual basis, kids would get this neurological disease, and they might survive, but they were fundamentally unable to, I mean, they were very, very, very disabled at that point and not being able to neurologically function. So the impact this disease had on families and communities was immense, and often considered, when through some surveys and stuff, the most feared thing a mother or father was having every year on their, would any of their kids get this? And so the African leadership has been raising this question for years, many years ago, saying, how come you guys have sort of figured out how to solve for meningitis in Europe and the US, and we're letting this happen? So kind of demanding the global community pay more attention. So a number of years ago, there was an effort combined with WHO. PATH was the intermediary leading it, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, a number of other players, the FDA, came together and started building a vaccine for this particular strain of of meningitis. And for meningitis A, and interesting, and why it's such an interesting story, I actually teach it in my class, is that the first effort was to say, okay, we'll just get somebody to give us more of this, and African leadership came back and said, that doesn't work. You have to get this product down below 50 cents a dose, or it won't be affordable in the long run for us. So that forced the scientists back to the drawing table to actually rethink the scientific journey. Long story short, is built a partnership across many different places, a vaccine manufacturer in India, the FDA, PATH was the lead of it, but there were many others, and now have a meningitis A vaccine. We've seen about 300 million people being vaccinated with it, no cases reported after that. And it's actually leading to the elimination of meningitis in Africa. We have to get it into the normal routine immunization to make this work. And the other exciting piece is that we are now working on there are other strains of meningitis. So we're actually actively, one of our projects is a pentavalent to get after all of the meningitis. So big success story, yeah. Thanks.
Steve, thank you. We have, as a thank you, made a donation to Rotary First Harvest, 300 pounds of fresh produce. 150 pounds of fresh produce. So families will get 300 servings on your behalf. Thank you so much. Thanks to our totem reporter today, Jeannie McKnight. Jeannie, thank you. The totem comes out midday on Friday. Our mic handlers, Laurel James and John Steckler. We have a 10-year archive of Seattle Rotary programs. We're videotaping right now. If you want to share today's program with someone, it'll be up in a couple of days on our website. That service is made possible by the generous sponsorship of our gold sponsors this year. Ken Ham of First Choice Health and Bob Alexander are both our gold-level underwriters of Seattle Rotary Online. Seattle Rotary Online is a significant club and community service marketing opportunity. If you want to reach other community leaders and also help out the club in a big way, contact Dave Endicott, our Rotarian at the back of the room there. Let's see. Let's talk about next week. Next week is a panel of female entrepreneurs at the Hyatt Olive 8 next week. If you've got some entrepreneurial friends, next week would be a great program to invite them to. And also, Mike Adams, come on up. Tomorrow night, we meet at 5 o'clock on Thursdays. So he's going to give us a preview of what's tomorrow night. Mike.
Thanks, Mark. So today I sat between two nice, interesting guys that I'd never met before. And I'm guessing that a lot of you are sitting with people that you haven't met before or don't know very well. Tomorrow night, like every Thursday night, is the evening edition where you can get to know some of the Rotarians here. It's a time of socializing. It's a time of discussion. And tomorrow night we have a discussion with Bill Fritsch, who was a former Disney executive. He has he's the CEO of Digital Kitchen. And if you've been to the Cosmopolitan Hotel in Las Vegas and see those screens with all that activity going on, he was the man that designed that. So come hear some of the discussion, get to know some of your fellow Rotarians. It's well worthwhile. It's at the James Moore, which is very close to the Moore Theater.
Thank you, Mike. Mike, thank you. So we have a tradition of our new members. So Linda and Mark, if you could both go to the back of the room, we'd like to greet you on our way out to say officially welcome to the club. So I'll excuse both of you to go to the back of the room at this point. So in conclusion, there's a saying in my family handed down from my Scandinavian ancestors: many hands make light work. I can't count the number of times that my grandmother or my mom or somebody told me that as a kid. I've long been impressed by the simplicity and the truth of those 5 simple words. First, it's true. The more people who roll up their sleeves and work, the faster any task gets done, whether you're doing dishes or trying to cure a global disease. But inherent in this saying is a call to action, and that is, hey, you guys, many hands make light work. In other words, hey, it's up to all of us to get the job done. As I look at the work PATH has done over the past 40 years, I can't help but wonder, what if PATH had never been created? We're talking hundreds of millions of lives impacted. We're talking tens of millions of lives saved. It's just hard to even get your head around that idea. I hate to think what the world would be like without PATH. Steve Davis, thank you and your team for your commitment to a healthy world. Thank you, Steve. And Carol Pandak, thank you to your team at Polio Plus. Polio is almost gone because many hands have gone to work for decades, many of you in this room. As we speak, more than 2 billion doses of polio vaccine are being distributed this year around the world. Yesterday, at World Polio Day, there's a figure that I just can't get out of my head. I think Chris Elias said this yesterday, but 16 million kids in the world are literally walking today who otherwise would either be dead or paralyzed from polio. 16 million. And that's because of you, and it's because of us and the work that we do. So maybe our new family saying should be, many Rotarians make light work, because it's true. I'm so proud of you. And as I said yesterday, wrapping up the global live stream at World Polio Day, someday soon, I hope that World Polio Day is simply a celebration, not a call to action, but just simply a celebration of the fact that polio's dead. And we're getting there. We're this close. Keep up the good work. We're adjourned.